Greetings everybody. Thank you so much for pressing play on the video. I'm delighted to be here to share some of my mother's life with you. My mum spent 28 years in Nigeria and she was a trailblazer, one of the first expatriates to go out there and have a mixed marriage with my wonderful father. And upon reflection, when she returned to the UK, she thought, I must document this and write a book about my experience. It's something she always wanted to do. And I think the main reason she wasn't able to complete this was she suffered from macular degeneration and she lost her sight. She was unable to read and write, and it really put a dampener on things. I was trying to assist her with this book as we went along, but that really got in the way. Fortunately, because I was involved with it, I have all the notes. And here we have her in her own hand, My Life in Nigeria. She started writing it in 2008. You can see my mum's writing here. And she also had some notes here, some further notes on her approach to the book. You can see some of them are just musings. And she sit down and plan how she would organize this book of her 28 years in Nigeria. So my original thoughts were, it was somewhat difficult to read with her handwriting, so I thought I'd do a video and I would read these notes to get this book out into the world. I was determined for more people to see my mother's stay and what she did in Nigeria. So I'd sit and I'd start to read these notes. And her handwriting was pretty difficult. I wasn't able to read it continuously. So I thought, well, I'll have to type them all out. So that was the next stage in this, shall I call it a labor of love? And I did. I typed every single note. Some of those words were very difficult to read. There were only 2 words I couldn't decipher. Every other single word I managed to get its meaning. And I've kept the original words. I haven't embellished or added anything to it. I've just kept it the way it is. I've broken it into timelines, and I have an appendix which takes us through her thoughts. Eventually, if I am able, I might try to put this into a booklet form, much like her order of service, even if I can get some pictures. Let's see how I go to transform that. But meanwhile, I've had it posted up to the streaming website in a PDF form, so if you click on it, you can actually read it for yourselves. But for some reason I've decided, let me continue with my original thoughts to read out the book, seeing as it originally wasn't typed and there was no way I could get this out into the world, but I couldn't read the words, so I ended up typing it all. As I go along, I'll use some props because Nigeria is very important to this story, and some of you might not know the background to Nigeria and where it is and a little bit about it. So forgive me if I get a little bit historical on you, and one thing I can say is that I do rather enjoy presenting, and you probably see that as I go along. So I have a few props before I get into reading Mum's book, just to set the scene, so that it's a little bit, hopefully, more of an enjoyable experience for you. Some of you listening now are actually characters in the book, so I do hope you enjoy seeing what Mum thinks about you. I certainly learned a lot about the way she led her life there and some of the historical order, things that I didn't realize even myself. I must say I remember everything in the book apart from the first couple of years when I was only 2 to 3 years old, but from 4 years on I remember every last little thing. So if you will allow me to start here with the map of the relating the UK to Nigeria, and here we are up in the UK. And Liverpool is where I'm trying to point to, because that's where Mum would take the boats. Initially there were, I guess there were planes, but she didn't fly. She had a lot of luggage and she had the children, us little ones, so we took boats. And the route would go past the Bay of Biscay, around here, all the way around, coming around West Africa, and back around this into the West African coast and up into Lagos. And you can see the outline of Nigeria. The journey took 13 days, and I've just looked it up, that the distance, I converted it from nautical miles into kilometers so that we all understand, about 8,500 kilometers. And given that it took 13 days, that was our lovely ship was going at 27 kilometers an hour, which is 15 knots. I shall probably mention a little bit about the boat later, but just to show you what it looked like, it was called the MV Oriole. And this is what it looked like. I'll give you a little bit of the history later on. I remember it well, because even when I crossed over at 4 years old, and 7 years old, I had a few trips on this boat. I could remember it was incredibly romantic. So we'll go through that. So now that we know where Nigeria is, and most of you did know that anyway, I can home in a little bit more, just to give an outline again. And here we have the West African coast again, and you can see Nigeria sitting nicely nestled there. Called Nigeria because the River Niger comes, I have to think this is the other way around, the River Niger comes through all the way from here down into the delta, into the tributaries and down here. And this is what, from a geological point of view, gave it all this oil in the sedimentary basin and made Nigeria quite wealthy, relatively speaking. But it has a high population, as you'll see. I'll go into that. So there we have the outline of Nigeria and Lagos, where the port was that we embarked when we came from Liverpool. About the, and to give a framework, something that I'd like to give an overview of is, so now I'm homing in again. Got another map of Nigeria. There she is. And I'd just like you to note that on this side here on the west, there's the Republic of Benin, and it has a long shape. It used to be called Dahomey. It changed its name. And this is the Republic of Togo, another even thinner shape, and then we get into Ghana. We used to take holidays to Togo, so I just wanted to frame that. We wanted to go to Cameroon, but we never quite got there. I'll tell you more why we didn't get there later on. And we lived in various parts of Nigeria, which I shall share later on to give you an overview of just how Mum traversed this great land. And one of the reasons that she moved around was that my father worked for the Nigerian Railways, and he used to be transferred. So she got to see a nice spread of this country at a time when it was much less populated than it is now, which is something that I'll also touch on a little bit later. So I'll start by reading my foreword that I've written for the book. Well, I might call it a booklet, perhaps. And later on, Mum gave an introduction to the book, which is a preface, which we'll read her words before we get into the outline of the book. So, My Life in Nigeria by Elizabeth Omotoso. Foreword by moi, Peter, her son. As I sit here in Doha, Qatar, a few months after the passing of my beloved mother, I am still struck by an overwhelming urge to meet her again. Not only for the memory left of the profound unconditional love she always showed me, and of her constant care, but that I feel I glimpse the light of her spirit itself at the end, and witnessed a beauty that has left an indelible burn. This labor of love to organize and type out her handwritten notes about her life in Nigeria, the Nigeria that she grew to love, is the closest I can come to meeting her again now, to help manifest her dream of publishing a book about her extraordinary life as much as is now possible. A book which she completed only in note form and was prevented from progressing further by her macular degeneration. She could no longer read or write. And through this process, remembering and reliving in great detail all but the very earliest years, I've absolutely marveled at the wonderful life she and our dear father gave us. What a glorious union, and may you both be reunited in peace and joy. I thank you both most sincerely, being forever in your debt. As I retrieved all her notes that I had filed long ago and decided to collate her story, I have also been struck by how many times she moved within Nigeria and how flexible she was. It was a full 6 years before we settled in a single location for a fairly prolonged period and made roots. And another striking fact was that despite the multiple locations, she worked in each and every one of them, even if it meant setting up her own school. This showing her industrious dedication to her teaching career and her pupils, and that she never considered being kept, but rather was a giver to the core. If not for her sight, she would have made a great success of her book. And so may this booklet please you greatly, dear Mum, and may it work a delightful magic on others, since I know this was your primary wish for wanting to share yourself with the wider world. For all that met you in person received your invisible blessing and were the better for it, your earthly mission being a resounding success. But may this innocent work put yet another ribbon on it. Through this, may your divine spirit reach and remain in this world yet further and longer, where I can feel it stronger, and where I can feel it stronger. Finally, my dear Mum, my exemplary Mum, an extraordinary human being, all that remains for me is to say thank you, and that I do want to meet you again. In loving and devoted memory, Peter Omotoso, Doha, Qatar, September 2022, when I wrote these words. So with that introduction, I'll just go back before I read my mum's preface to her book. I'll read her preface and then I'll get into Nigeria when we look into the outline. Preface, written 2005 in London. Now, my dear and beloved father had passed away in November 2020, 25th of November 2004. So this was a signal for my mother, because she would now have some time to work on this project. So several months had gone by since he passed away. Her preface is called About Myself. My name is Elizabeth. I was born in 1930, the first child of my parents in Akrivaya, North Wales. It's a small village. My father owned and was the editor of the local weekly newspaper. My mother was a dressmaker before her marriage. Most of my clothes were made by her when I was young. Eventually, I had 2 sisters. I attended the local primary and then a grammar school, and later a teacher's training college where I gained my teaching certificate. I taught in many primary schools in various places. I was always happiest amongst my pupils. While teaching in Nottingham, I met and later married my husband. He was a civil engineer and a graduate of Nottingham University. He was Nigerian from the western area of Nigeria. Our eldest son was born in our first house in Nottingham. Our second son was born in Chirk, North Wales. I joined my husband in Nigeria in 1961, and our third son was born in Kaduna, northern Nigeria. During this part of my life, my husband worked for the Nigerian Railway Corporation, and I taught in a variety of schools as we traveled within Nigeria. My children had all their primary education in Nigeria, and a happy time it was for us all. Eventually, the conditions in Nigeria became difficult. So in 1989, we moved our working life to London. We had bought a flat in which I now live, so accommodation was not difficult. I taught in a primary school in Peckham for 7 years and retired in 1996. My husband worked for Lambeth as a bridge engineer. He eventually moved over to England at the end as well. So she skipped the content of the Nigerian 28 years, but just given the framework of who she is. And that she taught for 45 years, faithfully, without fail, with no breaks. Our children, she says. Our eldest son now lives in Essex with his wife and children, Richard. Our second son is a petroleum engineer and works for Shell in Brunei, Peter. Our youngest son is a geologist and works in Australia, Simon. Our 2 youngest children are also Australian citizens. You can see how proud she was of her children, and we were her life, as was my father. My husband sadly died in November 2004, and so I'm living alone here, but my children are supportive, if from a distance, and I have friends. I have led such a varied and interesting life. I want to share it while I am still around to record it. My husband was always saying I should write about our life together. Now he is no longer here. I feel I must do this as a legacy to his memory. I need your help to know what form I should take to write it. And I do believe here she's invoking the help of my dad, who just departed. My son of 47 years, Richard, has returned from Nigeria. The remains of my past life were carried by him in just one suitcase. My past home is to be sold. My husband is no more. My connections with Nigeria, apart from my sons and some friends, is severed. I feel a great sadness and tears flow as I write my story. And so you can see how much this meant to her. So I have arranged the contents of the book according to the chronological order of her 28 years in Nigeria. And I think this might be a good time to talk a little bit more about Nigeria and give an overview of these locations so that when I speak on them, you can be a little bit more involved as to where they were and have a framework of her life there. The most amazing thing is that it was 6 years before we had a substantial period in any place. So first, I'll just say that another remarkable thing that I have dwelled upon since I started this. I'll just find it. Is Nigeria. Nigeria is so large that it has 16% of the population of Africa, and 1 in 5, which is not quite 20%, but 20% of the Black Africa is Nigerian. So 1 in 5 Black Africans is Nigeria. It's the most populous nation in Africa, with 220 million people. Now the print here is a little bit small, but the 2 rows across the top, and here's where I told you I like presenting. The 2 rows across the top are the population when Mum arrived. The bottom, the second row is 1960, and the top row is 2020. And if I just refresh my memories with the figures, we have a staggering statistic here. That now there are 220 people, but when Mum arrived, it was 45 million people. Really, really low. And now that the urban population, out of the 220 million, 107 million people live in cities. And that was 52% of the people live in cities, around 50%. But when Mum arrived, they were only 15% living in cities and a small population. So that meant that the number of people living in cities was only 7 million people, which is a huge, huge, huge reduction. So when I tell you some of the current populations of where Mum visited and where we all lived, not only can we divide those numbers by 5, because the population has increased 5 times in Nigeria, we can then divide it by 3 again, because the urban population used to be 15% and now it's 50%. So divide by 5 and then by 3 again. So we're down to about, well, we can do the maths here, 1/10. Yes, just a bit less than a tenth. Doing the numbers here, 1/15. To keep it simple, you can easily divide the current populations by 10 to see the sort of populace. It'll give you an idea of just how small some of these places were. So to keep it simple, we can easily divide by 10, but it would actually be less than that for the population of each of these towns and villages, I shouldn't say villages, towns and cities that I will mention to you. So there's another thing about Nigeria. You can see the blue line of how when Mum arrived it was 45 million, it's whizzed all the way to 200 million. This is 2020, but 2022 we're at 220 million. And you can see that America is up here and we're catching them up as we go. So that we're on a climb here, and the next 10 years it's forecast to go to 500 million. So one thing Nigeria has going for it is people. Here it is again. Current population today, 218 million. In fact, on this website, this number changes every few seconds. It's literally counting in real time the number of people. And the growth rate, it rocketed up, but it's still chugging along at 3% every year. So Nigeria is a powerhouse. If it can organize itself, it certainly will not be suffering from population decline as some other centers are, developed nations are now suffering from that. So now I'd like to give you an overview of, a quick overview before going into the words of Mum's life of our locations. So I hope you can see that. I have some orange and some yellow. The orange is where we actually lived, and the yellow shadings are of importance, places that we visited and had a lot of meaning to us as a family. When we arrived in Lagos here, at the port from Liverpool, as I just showed on that journey, we spent the first 10 months in a little town called Abeokuta, halfway between my father's town where Dad comes from, Ibadan, being a Yoruba man, and Lagos is the capital, used to be the capital of Nigeria. It's now moved, and more on that later. So this is where we started off in this little orange dot here in Abeokuta for 10 months, and then we moved to the north. We moved to the north and we had 4.5 years up here in these areas. First in Bauchi, we moved to Zaria, and then we moved to Kano. I'll mention more about these later. But we visited these locations, as you'll see, and they were very important to us. And very importantly, my brother Simon was born in Kaduna, and I'll mention some of these things. We took trips out here, which I'll mention, and we had trips all the way up to this wonderful dam, and we took trips across to Togo, this other country here, but not to steal Mum's thunder by saying too much about that, just to orient you. So you see we had a good footprint up here and down here. Now, why did we do this? One of the reasons we did this is because, as mentioned, my mother mentioned that my dad worked for the Nigerian Railways. And here we have the railway line, starting from Lagos, and very importantly, having a presence in Kaduna, Kano, up here, and Jos, which I didn't mention, one of the yellow dots. So generally all the areas we lived in the north were to service this rail. Dad would disappear for weeks and head off on trips down the line, and he had his own car, a whole, what would you call it? Yeah, they're called cars, aren't they? A whole segment of the train was for him, where his quarters were marvelous. We used to go with him occasionally, and it had beds and everything. Unforgettable memories for a child. And then furthermore, down here, in Lagos and Ibadan, we didn't get out to the east much. We didn't get, and there's no cross line, so you go up and then you have to come down. And this is where we spent time here and in the north, and it was all due to his transfers as the working in the Nigerian Railways. He eventually became assistant general manager, so almost to the very top. So now, having oriented you on the amazing land that Nigeria is, and how Mum witnessed it at a very innocent stage, 1/5 of the number of people and less than 1/10 of the number of people living in the cities. This is why it was such a magical time. It was a time of great innocence. Oil had not been discovered, and people were not, people had not been spoiled by the easy wealth that was flowing in. There was an etiquette of civility and respect amongst people, and my mum was greatly loved by all she met, and she also loved those she met, especially the Omotoso's family. And as I said in my eulogy, she said one thing about the Omotosos is that we are kind. I'll just take a glance around to see how the light is. So, as I mentioned, the outline is as shown, and each of the mini chapters is a location. So I've called it contents, location, dates, and duration in each of these places. So I hope that you're suitably oriented in this story of Mum, and that I might now go on with a better context of the sort of magical land that she met when she got out there, not meeting other people like herself, her being paving the way for others, and the occasional meeting of other Europeans, as she'll mention, and also the way that my father treated her and protected her so well as the gentleman that he was. And I wanted to say it at the end, but I'll say it earlier, maybe I'll repeat it at the end, that great blessings to Dad for providing the framework and setting the stage in which my mother played her part upon that stage, but the entire space was made available by my father, and he held it in his safe hands, and was as reliable and caring as we could possibly have wished for. He was a man that didn't say very much, so too easy to take him for granted and forget that without him, none of this would have occurred. He provided for it, but Mum played her part so wonderfully. So finally, my life in Nigeria. The journey begins. Chapter 1. Now, chapters 1 to chapters 4 were written on the 20th of April 2008 in London. So she'd waited 3 years since that forward preface about herself to write 3 years to write some actual words. And I think that's because I know my mum was always making herself busy, generally running things in a very stable way, so that our family had this great anchor that she provided to keep her health, to make sure she never lent on anybody, to be self-sufficient. And it all took time, so I don't think she had time to write the book, but finally she did. 20th of April 2008, London. 1960, she writes, Christmas, at home in Acrevire Abernant, North Wales, with Mum and Dad, my sister Mary, Richard, nearly 3 now, and Peter, 6 months. 1961, Femi, this is the name of my father, went to Port Harcourt in Nigeria, I think I'll show you on the map later, to take up his government job. As an aside, he came home once, back to the UK, and I met him in the fog in Liverpool in the boat, the Apapa. This is one of the great motor vessel boats. How romantic sounding in the fog, eh? I prepared to follow him with the children. Uncle Charlie, Irwin's husband, I remember my Auntie Irwin, helped with the boxes and arrangements, as well as Dad, her dad. By this time, Femi had a job with the Nigerian Railways as a pupil engineer, and so my fare was paid by them, about £110. We travelled first class. I had trunks and boxes which went before me to the docks in Liverpool. March 1961. Dad, her dad, hired a car and we went, Mum and Dad, to the docks in Liverpool without incident. Monica's husband, George, you'll hear a lot more about Monica later. She's an English lady who married a Nigerian, so George is Nigerian. Monica's husband, George, came to see us off. It was hard leaving Mum and Dad as I didn't know my future life. It was worse for Mum and Dad, and now that I'm older, I can appreciate more what they felt. Journey to Nigeria, 13 days. Around the Bay of Biscay, which is basically opposite Portugal, I had a bad sickness, not too rough otherwise. We had second sitting for dinner, and I had to leave Richard and Peter and go to the dining room, long dress necessary and dressed up first class. Peter, mixed feeding, still on bottle and baby food in cabin. Richard ate with the other kids at the top of the ship next to the captain's day room. Steep steps holding Peter in my arms. I think of all the sacrifices she's made for us. Only got off ship briefly at Takoradi, city in Ghana, almost there, almost getting to Lagos, as I didn't like leaving the children. Such was her dedication throughout her life, I must say. Lagos. So we're down the bottom. We arrived in Lagos and I went on deck and looked for Femi on the quay. Didn't see him at first, and he was there, behind me, on board. What a moment. I wore a new blue silk dress with a shawl collar. It was hot and humid and I was boiling. The immigration asked me for my marriage certificate and it was in the trunk in the hold. I can't recall how we got around that one, but we got away okay. Auntie Alice and only one other relation met us. I was grateful to Femi for this, as usually many friends and relatives generally met people from overseas. We went by car to Lagos to Abeokuta, as I mentioned, took under 1 hour, and arrived in our future home. So we're here now. Just took an hour to drive up from there to Abeokuta. Chapter 2, Life in Abeokuta, March 1961 to May 1962, 10 months. Our railway house in Abeokuta was a wooden one. 2 bedrooms, bathroom, sitting room and a kitchen, which was in a wooden house outside the main house. Connected by a cement slab path outside Abeokuta on the Lagos to Ibadan road. We had a house help. He was from Calabar and his name was Nelson. Calabar is a town all the way to the east of Nigeria, right near the Cameroon border. We also acquired a small sausage dog from the local vet, and he was unfortunately run over and killed by a taxi on the road outside soon after we owned him, name forgotten. We also had a local dog, too wild, and we gave him to a hunter. There were 3 houses in the compound. Higher up in the compound, a Mr. and Mrs. Adewoyin, and lower down, Major Ullman. His house was a bungalow. Major Ullman was British, and all were employed by the Nigerian Railways. We had hardly settled when Femi was to be away for 2 weeks on a tour of the East with a high official. I missed him and wrote daily. Hard time. Across the road, Lagos to Ibadan Road, was the junior staff compound. I got to know a lady called Abike there, and she used to come over and we chatted. Nice lady. I wonder where she is now. I took a picture of her with the children at Richard's 4th birthday. Find, she put. We planted flowers outside and had a garden, and also had chickens in a pen. The chickens unfortunately encouraged snakes, and we lost quite a few chickens and eggs to snakes. We also had scorpions. One walked through our sitting room and had to be encouraged out the back door. Just before Christmas 1961, Monica came to stay. This is the lady, the English lady from the Cotswolds, who is still there, and her daughter Susan gave a great eulogy speech at the funeral of Mum. More on Monica as we go along, but Monica came to stay. She was pregnant and actually had Jonathan, that's her first son, my godson, in an Abeokuta hospital in January 1962. I had no idea Jonathan was born in Abeokuta. It was nice to have her, and I have a picture taken of us around Christmas with a casuarina tree for a Christmas tree. Monica is hiding her bump. After Jonathan was born, Monica went to teach in Abeokuta Grammar School. She had a flat in the Challenge area of Ibadan, and we visited her and watched Jay's progress. She returned to the UK when Jonathan was about 1 year old. All these things I didn't know. Once settled, I got a job teaching history and religious education at Abeokuta Girls' Grammar School. The head was called Miss Plumtree. She later married. We had comfort, again from Calabar, in the east, to look after the children. At this point, I learned to drive our green Hillman Hunter car, so I could go and return from school early. I'm so impressed how early Dad got a car. Femi had to work on Saturday until 12 at this point, and he wore shorts to work. Occasionally on Saturday, Femi and I went to Ibadan to dance at the Paradise Club. Also at the hotel at the hotel on the Abeokuta Road. Abeokuta Ibadan Road. We also visited all the relatives there with R&P, as she called Richard and Peter, as well, of course. And she's talking to the trips to Ibadan. In May, 1962, we traveled to the UK on the MV Apapa. Now, there were 2 boats, the Oriole and the Apapa. I showed you the picture of the Oriole. I remember going on the Oriole later. I'll tell you that later. Monica came to the docks with calabashes, but we didn't get them. It took me ages to see what that word was, calabashes, from her handwriting. Peter, eggs only. Mum had terrible trouble with me. I just would not eat and was so fussy, so she's remembering Peter, eggs only. Mum and Dad met us at Liverpool and had a green coat for Peter. Spent nice time with Mum and Dad. So now that ended the 10 months. And I looked up the population of Abeokuta, and it was 500,000 people. It's 500,000 people now. 500,000 people. So let's divide that by 10. 50,000 people, probably less. Almost like a village in a way, because as per our formula, population has grown by 5, but far more people live in the cities now. So easily divide that by 10. So you get the general idea of how small that was. The trips to Ibadan, population is 3.8 million, for Ibadan now. It's a large city now. So if you divide that by 10, 380,000, just like a town at that time. It's just stunning. I hadn't thought of just how much it had changed until I saw the population. It's a completely different place now. So the 10 months in Abeokuta are finished, and it's a very, very small, one of the smallest places I'd say that Mum stayed. What an introduction to living in what was a little bit of a backwater with hardly anyone there. So chapter 3, Bauchi. Bauchi is, so we're about to go to the UK, but when she returns we come to Bauchi. So now she's moved from here all the way up to here. Again, of all the clusters that I'm about to discuss, Bauchi is the smallest. So she's gone from a very tiny little 50,000 people or less up to Bauchi. Population of Bauchi is now 0.7 million. Divide that by 10, 70,000 people. Let's just say 50,000 people again, because 10 is conservative. Bauchi first time, because we lived there twice, 1962 to autumn 1963. So this is 1.5 years was the next location. We went by ship to Lagos. So she's skipped over from after 10 months in Abeokuta. She took a ship back to Liverpool, not bad, after just 10 months, and then came back down again. Didn't stay how long she stayed with Mum and Dad, but perhaps a few weeks to months. And when she came back, she came back on the ship to Lagos, MV motor vessel Apapa or Oriel, I wasn't sure, but Apapa and Oriel were similar, and they have a similar look to the one I showed you. And by limited train, Lagos to Bauchi. So that means that she took this train line all the way, standard gauge. She'd come up and from Lagos all the way around. What a trip that must have been, all the way to Bauchi, because Bauchi is off in this area here. It doesn't go all the way through Bauchi. It's up here. Bauchi's up here. It's not written. Yep, up here. Oops, you can't see that. And up to there. Let's see if I can do it from there. All the way along here. Up to Bauchi here on the rail line. By limited train, Lagos to Bauchi. We had a cabin. That's what I should have said, that Dad had his own cabin on the train. The whole section of, still haven't got quite the right word. We had a cabin, and cabin would just be a cabin, but Dad had the whole railway car. We had a cabin and ate the meal on the train with 2 bunks. To my surprise, Femi met us in Kafanchan, that's on the way there, and travelled with us to our home in Bauchi. How lovely of him to do that. We had a newly built house, a bungalow, and we soon set about making it ship-shape. Femi soon got a nice garden in the front, and we planted string beans at the back. As there was no school, I set up a class in the dining room. See, she was industrious right then. Richard was 4+ and Peter 2, so really there were 2 groups. I remember I had Moya Shiel in Richard's group. The Shiels were Irish and Nigerian Railways employees, another girl about the same age from the Agricultural Institute. Her mother was from Kevin, can't remember the name. Kevin is a part of Wales, up where Mum comes from. Fancy meeting someone else from her area up there. The Bauchi Club was quite lovely, especially as there were some Italian guys working on the roads around. I went there especially to get books from the library. The highlight of our time in Bauchi were our visits to Jos, about once a month. We enjoyed the ride. So now I'll show you Bauchi. So we've already discussed that we were living in, now I'll show you Jos, living in Bauchi. So the orange are the places we actually live, the yellow are places of interest, and there we would drive 132 kilometers, I've memorized it. 132 kilometers, it seems so far, and that would have taken maximum 2 hours in Dad's Hillman Hunter. So we drive along there, and Jos is high up on a plateau, so it's cool. It gets very high. It's literally a plateau. We enjoyed the ride as we saw the shawshaws, almost naked people in the road. They were like a tribe that was a little bit primitive. I don't like to use that word, but they were. They didn't wear very much. Almost naked people in the road, and monkeys on the rocks at the side of the road. They used to have mining and exploded the rocks by dynamite. And I don't know why Mum didn't write this, but as we traveled once, a man had been injured by the explosions and he was bleeding, and we helped to take him to Jos to the hospital. And he got in the car, he was all dusty, and he had a wound. And I remember that, taking him. And strangely enough, on that trip from Bauchi to Jos, I always remember this. I asked my mum, Mum, why does it seem quicker when we make the journey back? It seems quicker than going there. She said, well, if you let a horse out and the horse goes to a certain place, it comes back quicker. The horse comes back quicker. And I probably botched it, but I, till this day, don't quite understand the logic of this answer that my mum gave me about a horse. And even now, it's not quite landing, is it? But she definitely said that, and I, for some reason, always remember asking her. So now, looking at that, heavens above, that made me, to autumn 1963, that made me 3 years old. Actually, I'll revisit that because we lived in Bauchi the second time. I don't think I could have asked that at 3 years old. Let's get to the second time we lived there, when I was a little bit older. I'll just check that sneak preview ahead. We lived there till March 1964, so probably around when I was just about 4-ish, 3.5, I was already asking that question. So my memory goes back quite far. I also just about remember the Bauchi house, but it could be the second visit. But those trips I do remember. Anyway, back to the story. Monkeys on the rocks, that's right, lots of rocks at the side of the road. We stayed at the railway rest house, very clean, and an old boy made super food. You see, everything was ship-shape. It was just so done properly. I remember it absolutely. I mean, I know it was a handover from the colonial way, but it was being run extremely well. Very clean, and an old boy made super food. Jos was quite chilly as it was quite high up. One day, when Femi was in Lagos, I had a telegram saying Mum had died. It was unbelievable. We knew she was in hospital, but had no notion her sickness was terminal. I was inconsolable. But Mr. Shield was good and got a message, got a message to Femi to tell him in Lagos. And the Welsh lady came with me to the post office and sent a telegram to Dad. I cried all night and lost my voice. I met Femi in Jos Airport, where you all know where Jos is now, the day Mum was being buried. She died on, and Mum has left the date blank. I wish I knew. But it was 1963. Month and day unrecorded. Femi was a great support at this time. I remember the time so clearly as I write this, sitting in Peter's living room in Brunei, looking at the South China Sea 45 years later, with my dear Femi no longer with me. She missed him so much. So actually chapters 3 were written in Brunei onwards, and just chapters 1 to 2 were written in London. So I will correct that in the book. So from here on, she's writing this in Brunei with me in 2009. Slight adjustment to what I said earlier. With my dear Femi no longer with me. One day a car drove up, and to my astonishment, Monica stepped out clutching Jonathan. Ah, Auntie Monica. She really does travel well, and even later I remember my dear auntie would travel a lot in Europe. She's a great traveller. They had travelled from Ibadan, partly by bus, to see us. The expats in the car had given them a ride from Jos, I think. Can't remember them staying, but I think they must have. At one point, another car pulled up, and I didn't know the people in the car, but they were the Asiaks, Mr. and Mrs. and two children, Kim and Karen. Mrs. Asiak was European and her father was a Nigerian. Mum met many of the couples that shared her experience of being British but living in Nigeria with Nigerian husbands. Now, I knew Kim and Karen later in school, and they were wonderful, wonderful girls. Emma, the youngest, wasn't born then. I am still in touch with Vera Asiak. So this is 2009 when Mum's writing this. And her husband died years ago, tragically, having his tonsils out. Femi said we should travel to the UK and see my dad. You see how good he was? He made a promise to Mum's dad that he'd look after her. And so he must have been thinking, you know, how is he after losing his wife? He said we should travel to the UK and see my grandfather. So really he delivered on his word to look after the family, basically. So he was even looking after my grandfather now. My mum was buried at the time. I was meeting Femi in Jos Airport. The railways flew him back to Jos. We went to the UK, and I can't remember the journey. By air this time? Question mark. And stayed with Dad until before Christmas, when we returned and had our second stint in Bauchi. Note, at the end of the garden, monkeys used to gather in the day. They were shy and always as we approached, they would run into the bush. We had indeed taken over their habitat. Chapter 4, Bauchi, second time, December 1963 to March 1964. 6 months this time. The first stay in Bauchi was 1.5 years. I can just about remember the house. Maybe this is the one I remember. So my memories are starting. I remember the trips to Jos, as I've mentioned, so around about 4-ish, my memories go back to 4 of everything. So now I've said written 5th March 2009, Brunei. But that first stint was also written by Mum in Brunei, 2009. I am vague about our journey back from the UK to Bauchi. When we did return, we had moved house. Our second home was further down the road, as some Indians were now living in our house. What was painful was we could see our beautiful garden bedecked with flowers from our first house. Our new home hardly had a blade of grass. One consolation was that the Indians seemed to tend our garden well. Once settled, we continued our life as before, and visits to Jos and the club being the highlight. I thought of dear Dad, now alone in Akravaya. He used to go to his sister's, Rhoda, for lunch most days. He managed quite well, and we were in touch. I continued to write this in Peter's Brunei home again on the 5th of March 2009, Farah's 15th birthday. It's one of her grandchildren. As I recall, we didn't stay in Bauchi too long this second time before we did leave. For Zaria, I was pregnant with Simon. So she was pregnant in Bauchi with Simon, and she met a lady called Edna Okeleke in Zaria, as that we were just heading to. So now we moved to Zaria. I'll just check on the light. Well, the lack of light, I should say. So now we're up in Zaria. We've moved from Bauchi, and here we are. So there's about 130 kilometers to Jos, and about 250 kilometers to Zaria. That was the trip. So that's about 380 kilometers, just to give you a scale of things. That's the route from there to there. Zaria, first house, May 1964 to February 1965, 10 months. We were housed in a railway rest house for a time. When we first arrived in Zaria, because I know we had difficulty in finding suitable quarters. Eventually, we were housed in a ground floor flat in a block of 4 with 2 bedrooms. Some expats had just left, so it was in good condition. We settled in, and Richard and Peter went to a small school in Zaria, and we met Edna Okeleke and her family. There were 3 children in the family: Martin, the eldest boy, Pauline, and Nikki. And I remember Pauline had ponytails that I would swing on and torment her a little bit, and she was the first female I ever remember. And till this day, we are somewhat in touch, and she came to Mum's funeral. And dear Auntie Edna is still in London. Pauline went to the same school as Richard and Peter. I remember meeting her. Simon was born in a private Catholic hospital in Kaduna on the 13th of December 1964 and was christened in the Anglican Church in Zaria. So now Kaduna was an 85-kilometer drive, and they must have had a better hospital in Zaria. And so she drove from there to get to Kaduna. And if we look at some of the populations, because I would like to share that, Bauchi, I already said, is 0.7 million people now, so we said maybe 50,000 people when Mum was there, because it was 700,000 now. Zaria is exactly the same population as Bauchi now, 700,000 people living there, 0.7 million. So we moved from a similar sized place, Bauchi, to another similar sized place, Zaria, that I've shown you. The trips to Jos, when we said we liked them, population of Jos is 0.9 million now. So we were going to Jos, had slightly more going for it, but still it wouldn't have been more than 60,000 people or so, if that. So now why did Mum go from Zaria to Kaduna? Because Kaduna now has a population of 1.1 million, so it's the biggest out of the ones we've discussed, and it must have had a better hospital. And so let's think, what would it have, 100,000 people, divide by 10 again roughly, when Mum was there. So she travelled to Kaduna to give birth to Simon. It was christened in the Anglican Church in Zaria. We had a party afterwards in the garden of the flat. I remember the garden out the back, big tree. I taught at the University of Zaria Staff School, which I didn't know, and Edna looked after Simon when I was at work. I know the block of flats, so remember it so clearly, and Auntie Edna. Richard and I both remember Auntie Edna coming to the flat. During this time, we met Josie and Peter Olonye. Peter later died in a car accident. Peter later died in a car accident, I believe. Their children were Jacqueline, Edmund, Juliet, and Sandra, born later. Now, Auntie Josie is still a dear, dear family friend and was so supportive during Mum's passing, and one of Mum's best friends, and we see her as family. So how wonderful to see the story of meeting her up in Zaria, and to know this fact that it was around 1964-65 we met dear Auntie Josie. And Edmund is my firm friend to this day. He flies for Emirates. He's a pilot. Their children were Jackie, Edmund, and he lives in Abu Dhabi, Dubai. I remember once when Femi was on tour, when he'd go on his rail car and inspect the line and things like that, the rail line, Peter and Simon, who shared the second bedroom, which I also remember, became very ill and were vomiting and had fever. Typhoid was diagnosed at the time, was diagnosed as a possibility. Anyway, they recovered after some time, although it was quite scary at the time. Other people in the other 3 flats in the block were Indians, Anna, a European married to a Nigerian, and another set of Indians with a small child. Chapter 6, Zaria, second house. February 1965 to end 1965, 9 months. To the best of our knowledge and memories, the next move was to a bigger house in Zaria. Same style as our railway house in Ibadan later, down south. Wonderful designed house, I remember it, which I'll describe it later when we get to Ibadan because I have more memories, but it was the same design. The Fulanis, which is a tribe prevalent in the area and are nomadic, would bring raw milk and eggs. We tested the eggs by floating them in water, and they were guinea fowl eggs. We also had butter and milk. We had a green Hillman Hunter, must have been the same one driven up from the south. From here we moved to Kano. Now Kano is rather special because Kano is absolutely huge now. So here we are all the way up far in the north part of Nigeria. Beyond this border is Niger, and even further north is the Sahara Desert. And there's a wind that turns south and blows called the Harmattan wind that blows dry air. It becomes cooler but very dry. And so Kano is massive. I was quite surprised to find it's the second largest city in Nigeria, with a population of 4.2 million people. Lagos has 15.4 million people down here, but I always thought Ibadan was the next, but it's not. It's 3.8 million only. 15.5 million, 15.4 million in Lagos, which is of course huge, 3.8 in Ibadan, and we have 4.2. Now the population, I haven't really highlighted it here. Whilst Mum was towards the end of her stay in Nigeria, Nigeria very wisely decided to put a capital in the middle to unite things. There was too much power down here. So while Lagos is the financial capital, and it used to be the political capital, we'd already had a civil war, which you'll see I describe later. So they decided to put this in the middle to have a cohesion. And now Abuja, as it's called, has a population of 3.4 million. So I think that will pay great dividends down the many decades later as Nigeria improves itself, we hope, as we go along. But that didn't exist at all at this. It wasn't even an idea at that stage. So now if we do the divide by 10 again, 4.2 million. Now maybe we were talking approaching 500,000 people, 300,000 people, which would have been quite a large place compared to the others, an order of magnitude larger than the others, and it would have had an airport that would have allowed direct travel, I believe, direct flight to the UK. I never quite found out if that did, but I think that we flew directly from there. In fact, more on that later. So now we left Zaria, as I just said, and we're in Kano, and from end 1965 to August 1966, still moving because of Dad's transfer as he climbed the ranks within the Nigerian railways. 9 months we were there. I can't remember the details of our move to Kano, but Simon was about 1 year old. That's about right, because Simon was born in 1964. Our quarters in Kano was a bungalow on a corner plot. I remember it well. Comfort was the nanny of Simon, and Garuba was the steward. The kitchen was outside the main house, connected by a covered walkway. There was a wooden stove, and Garuba was a good cook. Now this Garba, the steward, I remember, of course, was Muslim, and he said that he just told me one day that with his God, you could have anything you wanted if you asked that God. And I always remember just scratching my head thinking, wow, I really have to find out this God and, you know, believe myself somehow. I would love a God like this, I thought. And such a sweet memory. I really pondered this for quite some days. So Mum goes on, I found a teaching job with a Mrs. Gallagher, and we started a Corona school in Kano. 2 classes. I taught the younger children as well as Peter and Edmund, that's the son of Josie, whom I'm still friends with, the pilot. Josie and Peter's son, since they had moved to Kano. And I remember one day in the class blurting out, my mum's name's Betty, and embarrassing my mum. And I felt it was so naughty that when I got home, I was so nervous because Mum said, I'm going to tell Dad. And she did tell him. He said, you know what he said in class today? And I was so embarrassed, and I regretted saying that, telling the class my mum's name, because it was disrespectful. The weather in Kano was drier and less humid than the south, because, as I said, it was getting further north, but hotter than Zaria, and it could be cold at night. We had a wood fire which was lit by the Magadi. Magadi is the night guard, when he arrived at 6 p.m. every evening. The flies could be bad in the hot summer months, and the days and nights windy and cold during the winter, December to January, when the Hamatan wind would blow from the Sahara Desert to the north. 2 incidents stick in my mind. Getting Simon's first shoes. Comfort, the nanny, Peter, Simon and I were driving the car one Saturday to get Simon shoes. Simon about 5 months, ? And we were met by a mob carrying sticks. They surrounded the car and shouted, Oyimbo, Oyimbo, which means white woman, go home. They eventually let us go, shaken but not harmed. And Simon had his first shoes from Bata, B-A-T-A, the shop that was all over Nigeria that sold shoes. In fact, Bata means shoe. It's so prevalent, they're synonymous. My first taste of the unrest and civil war in Nigeria, which was to follow. More of that later. The second incident was later when Richard had his 6th birthday party, January 17, 1965. January 1965. Because of the unrest in the town, only a few children, 2 or 3, showed up instead of the 20 or so invited. Lots of food left and disappointment. As things were unsettled and Femi was going to Kenya, we flew out of Kano, that's right, there was an airport, to the UK around August 1966. And this is because the war was brewing and the unrest started in the north. So when we left in August 1966, the war was declared roughly a year later, in July 1967. And in fact, as a small child, it was horrific because we were told a story that at the crossroads of the road and the rail, when a train comes, there's a little guard post, and a bell goes and the road is closed off by gates so that the train goes through and the cars coming have to stop and wait for the gates. I wonder if I should even say it, but apparently this man was from the eastern part of Nigeria, the Igbos, who were trying to break away from Nigeria, and so they were very, very not welcome anywhere, and apparently they took this man out of the guard house and cut him into 4 pieces. And we were told this story. And And it really didn't sit very well with me, and I felt quite aghast about what had happened and the sorts of things that were going on. And Dad walked to the corner of our house and took out our name from the signpost, but luckily my dad was from the right place, and we hid one of his friends who was from the eastern side of Nigeria, the people that they were hunting down, in our house for safekeeping for a while. But luckily Dad was from the southwest, so he was safe. But just to be a little bit safer, I remember him walking and removing this signpost. If I went to Kano and you showed me that house, I'd know it. I remember it on the corner block there. So we flew out. So there's always a silver lining. So because of this now, the next chapter of the book is a 10-month stint in Wales. From chapter 8, Akrafaya, Wales, 1966 to June 1967. August 1966 to June 1967, 10 months. And why I think it was a silver lining for me personally is I got to know my grandfather, and I had memories of my mother's land, where she came from for 10 months. After all, I was technically Welsh. I'd been born just down the road from there. And just, if I hadn't have had that, Grandpa would have been just a word, just a name. And so some of that culture imbued into me. So when people ask me where I'm from, I say, look, I really am half Welsh and half Nigerian. It's like, there's both. I have to honor them both. Isn't it logical? But I did get a dose of Akrafaya, Wales. And as an aside, we've moved on because now we're chapter 8, and Mum has written chapter 8 to 11, that's to the end of the book, dictated to me by Peter in Qatar, Doha, on February and March 2012, since my macular degeneration prevented me from reading or writing. So what had happened is I'd moved on from Brunei, worked in Thailand, and then came here in 2011. So I've been here 11 years in Qatar. And my mum had come and said, Peter, you know I can't read or write, but we left off the book in Kano. I would like to continue and cover all the other locations. Will you help me? I said, yes, Mum, I will, when I come home. She says, I'll dictate to you in the evenings, and then you write it down. And I bought her a book for the recorder for the blind, a book that you could record. And she was trying to get to grips with this, to dictate by herself, but it was a little bit tricky. So in the end, we didn't use that device, and I wrote all this down by hand. So here we are now in 2012. It's the busyness of Mum's life that didn't allow her to focus, and then I think she kept putting it off a little, and then her sight went. But she still didn't give up, so luckily I'm so grateful that we did this in Doha, Qatar, where I still am. So here now we've had a 3-year gap from the Brunei sessions that she wrote by herself. Peter attended Akrafaya Junior School and got a very good report. You can see who's dictating it. It instantly favors me from the first sentence. Ooh, it's going to have a little bit of a slant on it. Let's see how much of a slant. Richard went to Blue Coat School in Birmingham. I remember that, and because he was older than I was. Peter remembers teasing and fighting Simon on the bus and embarrassed Dad. That was our grandfather. I was too prone to teasing people, as everybody knows, but I do remember the incident. That Grandpa came back and complained that we were so naughty, or I was so naughty. Dad, that means Femi, her husband, but she would often call him Dad or Daddy when we were in his presence. So Femi came to school, he visited and came, walked up to the school from up a hill from the house to see Peter, and walked through the snow. It's a memory I'll never forget. I came out of school and there was my dad walking towards me in the snow. It was just quite something. He'd come all the way from Nigeria. He traveled a lot. to make Mum comfortable and be with us. We took the MV Oriole, our beautiful boat, the one that I showed you earlier, this delightful boat, and from Liverpool, question mark, I think it must have been Liverpool, to Lagos. Peter almost drowned in the swimming pool when someone pushed him in, a little girl. I remember it vividly. I was going down for the last time and a man, ex-army, saved me. It was awful, absolutely awful. And I couldn't eat that night. I was in my bunk feeling so ill. But this boat, the beautiful MV Oriole, was commissioned in 1951. So if we were taking it in 1966, it was about 15 years old by that time, but it was still in very good condition. It had 329 passengers and 149 crew. So it was quite sizable, and it continued in service as the Oriole till 1974, so about 7 years beyond when we last used it. But it was bought by a Greek tycoon, and because I was quite curious as to what happened to the boat, and continued under the name Mariana from 1974 till 1989. So quite a few years it was in service. It sat in Greece at some port from 1989 to 2001, where it had its last sail in 2001, and sadly was broken up in Alang, India, which is a great shipbreaking port, in 2001. So it is no more, but quite a long life there if you count from 1951 to 2001. 50 years. 50 years it lasted, but with less service at the end. What a beautiful vessel it was, by the elder Dempster Lines. So there it was, and I almost perished on the pool. The pool, I recall, was, where was that pool? It was at the back. Yeah, it would be at the back. It was just about there. A little square thing or rectangular thing. So now here we are back in the UK again, and now we've come back to Ibadan. Now this is the city of my father, 3.8 million people. So divide by 10, about, 380,000 people at the time. It's unbelievable how small it was. It's just stunning. Or it would have been a bit more because 7 years have gone by. So we've maybe say 500,000 at the time. City of 500,000 people or so. Not more than 1 million. So there we have come. Now this is the first time that Mum has spent a significant amount of time in any single place, because everywhere else has been rather fleeting, as you've seen, because of my father's work and also the need to return to the UK. So this June 1967 to end 1972 is 4.5 years in this location. So we moved into the house in New Reservation, a suburban area, Ibadan. It was the same design as the second house we had in Zaria. It was a very nice two-story design with balconies all around in a nice big garden, absolutely lovely. The Nigerian Civil War, Biafran War, had just been declared. So all that time we'd been away up in Wales, it was brewing and brewing and brewing, but we were able to return to Nigeria in the West because the war was being waged in the East, the Biafran War. This area wanted to break away and succeed and become a separate nation because the oil wealth was down here, most of the oil. And it was awful because the tactics to defeat them was to cut off their food supply. And they literally were starved out. And over 1 million Biafrans, as they wanted to be called, starved in this 2.5-year war. And then they had to throw in the towel. And there were jokes in the UK. It's awful. How do you save a drowning Biafran? And they say throw him a polo mint. So you can see, it was in the psyche of the world that these images of literally bone-thin people starving to death. So it was not a nice experience, but even though it was being waged in the East, as I've just shown you, in the West we were cocooned from it, and it did not impact us very much, even though when we arrived it had just been declared. The Nigerian Civil War had been declared, but was being waged in the East and lasted 2 years, 6 months until January 1970. Simon went to a nursery down the road. I didn't realize that. And Marina, our gardener, used to push him in his pushchair on the road. We had chickens and ducks, and we planted corn. Remember it. We had a lovely dog called Digger and a parrot, Polly, who could speak and said quite a few words. I'd forgotten how much a little plot of corn was. We used to eat that corn, and we did quite a lot of chickens too. Dad bought a monkey, but Digger killed it. It lasted days. We didn't take the necessary precautions. I was teaching at All Saints Church School in Jericho, a wonderful primary school across town, and Mrs. Lambeau was the head, another European lady. Peter spent just 1 day in class 3 and was moved to class 4. So you can see once again that I must have been influencing Mum's dictation, singing, talking myself up. Richard was in class 5. I had a new red Morris Minor brought over from England. Dad collected it from Lagos and it broke down on the way. British cars, eh? It cost £1,100 and it was a Morris 1100. £1,100 that car. I added in, the number plate was SUN 395J. I always remember that, son. Some of our houseboys were Harrison and Theophilus. By 1969, Richard had moved to International School Ibadan, which was just a fantastic school. Note that he started in All Saints School from the Blue Coat School in Birmingham after Peter. He came a little bit later, but of course was ahead of me. By 1970, the next year, Peter was at ISI, International School Ibadan as well. And around about that time, Auntie Mary visited. Now, Auntie Mary was my mum's younger sister, and she was a real doll, just such an attractive lady. And I think it was a miniskirt time, so she looked just so lovely. August 1969. And she was so kind. Every month, 3 months, she'd send a bundle of comics to us, all wrapped up in brown paper. And we just couldn't wait to open them and have the Beano, and mainly the Beano, I think, and comics, basically. We loved them. Gosh, singing Auntie Mary's praises. What a great auntie she was to us boys. An uncle met her in Lagos in a Range Rover. She spent 2 weeks, and Dorcas, who's a dear auntie who lives in Atlanta and is still here, still with us, gave a farewell tea. Mum was taking I was taking Mary Yetunde Latunji, who's a younger, the daughter of our dear Uncle Dele Latunji Alhaji, who just passed away last month, and who at the age of 92 and was a great family friend. So that would have been his daughter was being taken by Mum with Auntie Mary and Simon. Fancy Yetunde Latunji being in the car to see the Ibadan Zoo, which is quite a good zoo. When coming out of the petrol station, my car was hit and we had to have a new right wing. We were without transport for 2 weeks. I remember it. In 1971-72, my dad was very ill, and Simon and I went on the boat to Liverpool, back again. Auntie Bronwyn, my younger sister, had been looking after Dad in Akravaya. The prognosis was bad, and Dad died peacefully in August 1972. He had cancer. I attended the funeral, and Simon stayed with Auntie Posh next door, the opposite house. Meanwhile, Femi, Richard and Peter were in the junior quarters in a flat, and Dad was awaiting a new posting in Lagos. They'd moved us out of the nice house as Dad was moving. I remember that too. Because of this, Richard and Peter became boarding students at ISI. My main friend in Ibadan had been Dorcas and the All Saints Church School staff. She did know dear Auntie Dorcas. What a great friend, all the way till the end of Mum. She was a great friend. She left Nigeria and is still in Atlanta. This was a very nice period within my life. From Ibadan, we had taken trips to Kanji Dam and trips with Auntie Mary. We had a fantastic trip up to Kanji Dam. It's 360 kilometers from Ibadan. You can see it in yellow. We traveled up. We stayed in guest house along the way, saw this amazing dam, and came all the way back again, the Kanji Dam. A wonderful picture of Dad at Kanji Dam. I think I have it here, just to share it in Mum's, I think it's this one. So handsome with Simon. I think that was one of our trips to Kanji Dam. I believe. He's next to a boat. It could have been to the Togo, the neighboring country. Which I'm just about to speak about. We'd taken trips to Kanji Dam and some trips with Auntie Mary. We had also taken trips to Dahomey, Benin, which is the next country, because it changed its name. The capital is Cotonou, but now the capital is called Porto Novo. And then the next country, Togo, which still retains the same name. And Lomé is the capital. So we'd cross from here, across this country here, Benin, crossed into this other slim country, Togo, all French speaking. So it was so exotic because suddenly everyone's speaking French. So you felt that you traveled a million miles away, even though it was reasonably close. So it was a perfect way to change your environment. And here they'd have croissants and all kinds of French influenced food. I remember eating and thinking, my heavens, these people can cook. The French had left their mark. And just across the way was Ghana. Now, my younger brothers visited Ghana extensively, Simon, but I've never been. We stayed across the border. And once, as we swam off the shore of the sea here, we saw beautiful giant sea turtles. And my brother's a naturalist in many ways and loves animals. So it was fantastic for him, Simon, to see these and in their natural habitat. And I remember spotting them as well. I think we went at least twice. And it was so romantic. So we had also taken trips to Dahomey and Togo, Lomé, as I've just shown you. In Lomé, we had lovely food and stayed once at the Sailor's Home, a basic hotel, and another hotel was called Hotel de Lac, which had paddle boats in the pool. We also had great parties in the lovely house in Ibadan for Femi and I and the boys' birthday parties. We used to visit Ibadan Recreation Club and swim and sometimes buy suya nearby, which is a local satay. We used to eat curry puffs too. Femi was driving a Peugeot 504. Indeed, this was a wonderful period in our life. Absolutely wonderful. And I was only 12 when we left. Note: when I returned from my father's funeral, I stayed with a Polish family, since I could not give up my job until the end of term, and Simon's term also. Richard and Peter were boarding in International School Ibadan at this time. At this time, I had a bad illness, bleeding, and was taken to the hospital and had a scrape operation. Auntie Dorcas let Femi know, and he came back from Lagos immediately. Peter also had dengue fever at some stage and was hospitalized, and the Cameroon trip was cancelled. I remember I was so ill. I remember I could barely walk, but I didn't even realize we were planning to make this huge trip across to Cameroon. I'm not sure how we would have got there. Also French speaking, but dual, they speak English as well. Richard was a leader of the Scouts at some stage. Eventually, Simon and I joined Femi in Lagos. So there was quite a lot of movement going on there. Dad had to go to Lagos. No, we went to Wales first of all. We left the big house and stayed in a temporary house, waiting for Dad to go to Lagos. So we said, oh, well, we better become boarding students, Richard and I. Dad went to Lagos. Mum came back to Ibadan alone and stayed with the Polish family. And when her term was up, she joined Dad and we remained boarders. So we were quite nimble and flexible, and Mum showing her great flexibility as usual. 4.5 years, the longest place we've ever stayed. Chapter 10, Lagos. End 1972 to 1978. 5.5 years. So that would have made 12 to 18. Now for me, from a 12 to 18-year-old to have holidays in Lagos was fantastic because it was such a funky place and a happening place. Of course, I was a boarding student, so I wasn't always living there. But every time I came from Ibadan, I could just remind you, Richard and I were boarding up in Ibadan, and now we suddenly moved to Lagos. Now it's about 132 kilometers again, just to check that distance. Yes, it is. And let's look at this Lagos, 15.4 million. So divide by 10, million people, 1.5 million people. But mind you, a lot of the rural, when they said the urban centers were much less, I guess that perhaps not have applied to Lagos because it's such a magnet, but you can at least divide by 5, at the very, very least. 15.4 divided by 5, so that would have made it 3 million people. 3 times 5. Let's say about 3 million people, because by now we're 1974, aren't we? And the population has increased quite a bit. So probably about 3 million people or so at that time. Tops about 5 million people. Times 5. Yeah, 5 million, say, at the top. 3 to 5 million people, making estimates here. So when we got to Lagos, we stayed in 2 homes. But the first house, so here we go, was 1.5 years in the first house. Ebute Metta was the name of the area, and it's a railway compound, especially for railway staff, quite central within Lagos, but cordoned off and quite secluded and green, bordered on the east by a swamp, which you can't cross. Really privileged place to live. We didn't realize how lucky we were, central but still secluded at the same time. The land there must be worth a fortune. So our first house was in this special Ebute Metta railway compound area. Small bungalow, 2 bedrooms and a store, which became Richard's bedroom. In Ebute railway compound on a corner was Cooper Street. The compound was a secluded area with a marshland on the eastern side. Whilst there I contracted hepatitis and was off school for 6 weeks. It was David Anyanko's wife, Edith, who treated me. It was a blood condition and I was jaundiced. I was teaching at the Ebute Metta Corona School, just opposite from the house next door. Mrs. Asiak, that lady again, was the head, and Mrs. Mogaji was the deputy head. The Asiaks lived opposite us. We were about 2 years in this house. It was 1.5 years. In the end, we got a Doberman puppy called Cleo, given to Peter by his good friend Igor, who is still my very close friend till this day. Igor is from Serbia. Digger, our older dog, gradually got used to Cleo, used to her. Richard and Peter were still boarding in Ibadan and visited on holidays. We and the Asiaks took turn with the trips to ISI to ferry us to and fro. Femi and I would stay in the Premier Hotel in Ibadan, which is a nice hotel on the hill, when we came to visit them at ISI. Theo, one of the houseboys, came with us from Ibadan. Harrison didn't come with us. The Asiaks gave us vinyl records for Christmas. The boys listened to the Football World Cup on the radio, and West Germany beat Holland in the World Cup final. Wow, I enjoyed that. Femi and I attended cocktail parties and dinners. Second house in Ebute Metta. end 1974 to mid 1978. So that's a 4-year chunk of time. We moved further down towards the end of this great secluded compound area into the same style house as we had in Ibadan, the one I said was so nice, and the one in Zaria with the 2-story and beautiful balconies around it. Another great, such a great design, a colonial designed home, but all cement, no wood. Around 1974, we moved to the far end of the railway company to a bigger house with the same design as in Ibadan, the new reservation, and our second house in Zaria. The house was meant for an expatriate and it had been renovated, so it was even more special. It was, though, near the swamp and somewhat isolated. It was here Dad bought his light yellow Mercedes-Benz. Wow, it's beautiful. And I got my lovely silver grey Honda Civic. It was a wonderful time, because now I was 14. From this house I was 14 to 18 years old. Richard and Peter were still in International School Ibadan, boarding, and Simon went to Loyola College in Lagos as a day student. I finished with the Corona School, which was at the far end of the compound, and had a class in my own house. Here we go again, very industrious. At its height, I had 7 children. Wow, one day a cobra came up the steps. The children could not go out, and one day a big snake went into the garage. Huge thing, I remember. We never saw it, but we never found it. Simon had his civet cat in the boys' quarters. He loved animals. We also had a chameleon. Cleo, our Doberman, came to this house but needed to be put down at the age of 3 due to distemper. She couldn't move her back legs. The faithful digger was still with us, but eventually became ill and was put to sleep at 13 years old in the garden in 1978. I was at school when it happened. He was buried in the garden. We loved Digger. In 1976, Peter was suspended from International School Ibadan and had to come back to Lagos, and was in the house for the General Murtala Mohammed coup. He was assassinated. This was a huge thing, and I just happened to be there. We did a little bit of vandalism, me and some guys, and got carried away and got wild, and they sent us all home. It was very embarrassing. I remember studying for my exams at home in Lagos. Femi and I continued to attend many railway functions and other functions. Femi was made general manager of Femi was made assistant general manager of the Nigerian Railways. The Nzegu family lived nearby, and Mr. Nzegu was the general manager. I knew his son, Ifeanyi. Simon would fish and play in the swamp, and with David and Yanko. One day they broke many windows in one of the flooded houses. He went a little bit wild for some reason. The Nigerian Railways had a new policy of bringing in Indians to replace the top staff, and Daddy was one of the people replaced. He was only 46 and I was 48. But he was only 48. I'll change that. They were both the same age, more or less. So this was 1978 when it happened. I think Dad was 1 year less younger than Mum. He was 47, Mum was 48. So this was 1978 when it happened. I remember coming back, and Dad was upset. He had a glass of whiskey, and he wasn't a drinking man. Richard entered University of Lagos, which is called UNILAG, University of Lagos, in 1976, and studied economics. Peter was still in International School Ibadan. Peter, the year later, went to Nottingham University in September 1977, following in Femi and his 3 uncles' footsteps, because my dad and his 3 brothers went to Nottingham Uni. Their father had enough money to send 3 of his children in the 50s, first wave of overseas students, and that's how they met Mum. Simon was still in Loyola College, Lagos. So Now that would have meant when the end of staying in Abuja Meta, when my dad, when this happened with the railways changing staff in 1978. But we're not quite at the end of our 4-year stay there yet. Still within that stay. So in 1976, I went to the UK and stayed with Edna Okeleke, who was now back from Nigeria, and I bought 5 Marlow Court in Dulwich, London, where where Mum passed away in the end. In 1977, we went as a family during summer and stayed in this flat, as well as took a trip to Rome, compliments of Mr. Bernardi, one of Dad's associates, one of Femi's associates. It was a wonderful holiday, and we went to Tivoli Gardens, Pompeii and Naples. I remember it well. It was stunning, the whole family. We went around Rome in a London taxi, and during the Rome stay, Dad had some mild malaria. Back in London, we bought a Sony Trinitron, which is a video recorder, and some other items, and really enjoyed being in this exciting new location together. It was a wonderful time. Peter went to Nottingham University from the flat in 1977. I was friendly with Irish people in Apapa, a Lagos suburb, and he was the general manager of the flour mills. Femi and I used to go there for parties, and we also went to the French embassy. I went over with Simon to Nottingham to enroll him in Trent College near Peter in Nottingham University and near Auntie Mary, who lived in Nottingham. I stayed in the flat in London. After this, I returned directly to Femi in Ibadan, since he had moved from Lagos in the interim, seeing as the Nigerian Railways was finally over for him. I had to ring Auntie Dorcas and ask where our house was, because I didn't know. It was 4 Saka Agbaje Street, New Bodija Estate, Ibadan. Our house that Dad had built. Very prescient, very wise that he built himself a nice house in his hometown, so he had that to go to when the railways ended. Good move, Dad. When Femi was made to retire in 1978 from the railways, he initially went to stay with his brother, Uncle James, in Ibadan. I think the house wasn't ready. That's right. Chapter 11, Ibadan, 4 Saka Agbaje Street. 10 years. Actually, it's 11 years. I will correct that to 1989. 11 years to 1989. Look at that. So now Mum is back again to Ibadan for her longest stay in any one place. So we're back up here now in Ibadan. There we are. Femi already had the house very nice, but it required a lot of finishing touches. I went back to All Saints School, Jericho, to teach second time around, and at this time I had a new Volkswagen Passat. It was at this time I met the Fabumis, and the youngest daughter, Rosalind, was in the next class up in All Saints. Now, the Fabumis, Riva Fabumi is from Scotland, and she's married to a Nigerian, and they're still living in London, and they became very firm friends of my mum, as well as their 3 lovely daughters, who were great friends. They were almost sisters, you could say, to us 3 boys. They had 3 girls and us 3 boys. So that's when she met the Fabumis. She resumed her friendship with Dele and Jocelyn Datunji. Uncle Dele, I just mentioned, passed away last month. Such a great man and firm friend. And Auntie Jocelyn lives in London, not in London, in England. And Auntie Dorcas has moved to Atlanta. She resumed her friendship with them. She was slightly older than them, but she was just about the same age as Uncle Dele. Richard was still in Unilag and would come home some weekends in his Suzuki Jeep, a really cool car. Richard graduated in 1979. He worked in Ibadan for a short time after doing his youth corps for 1 year up in the north in Maiduguri. Eventually, he went to work in Lagos for Dad's Italian associates, Mr. Bernardi and Co., and lived in Victoria Island. I remember visiting him, and then later in Auntie Josie's quarters. Peter graduated in 1980, and I was there in Nottingham to see it. Uncle Isaac also came to the reception, Dad's brother, but with a different mum, but same dad. He was late for the graduation, but he came to the reception, and Auntie Mary was there. Peter got a first-class honours. Now, did Mum say that, or did I prompt her? We'll never know, I can't remember. I also met Freddie, Peter's friend from Malaysia, and his parents. Peter returned to Lagos to work for Phillips Petroleum in Nigeria, but only spent a few weeks in the job, since he was only being paid as a local. He returned to London to work for Energy Resource Consultants in 1981, and I worked for them for the next 4 years. And I was so busy working for them, I didn't come to visit Nigeria very often. This was one of the reasons why I was even after finishing my Nottingham Uni, I didn't get back to this 10-year spell that Mum was, this 11-year chunk. This is why I keep checking in my mind. She was there for 11 years. Where was I? Well, I was off doing uni, and then I was off furiously working in London. It was such a busy job, whilst she was in Ibadan with Dad, and I was living out of the flat and commuting to work. Very fortunate that we had this flat, eh? Simon left Trent College and joined me in the flat and started in South London School in Norwood about 1980. Luckily, Peter was working in London then, as I said, in ERC, Energy Resource Consultants, and living in the flat. So Simon was able to stay with him. Simon eventually went to Southampton University in 1983 to read geology. Remember, this chunk of stay in this house is from 1978 to 1989, a big chunk. I continued to teach in All Saints schools until about 1984. So that means she was 6 years there. Mum did well. Mrs. Oyawaye was the head, and Mrs. Oniinde was still the secretary. Now, my dear Auntie Marianne is living in London, and her son Femi, whom I met in All Saints School at the age of 9, is my oldest friend, and we're still bosom brothers. And he lives in the USA, my dear friend Femi. So his mum was still working there as a secretary. Mrs. Banjo taught arts. Socially, I saw Elaine Jegede, another expat lady, Riva Fubumi, the Scottish lady I've just mentioned, Auntie Riva, Peter, Elaine's husband, Elaine, Femi, and I would go to the Ibadan Recreation Club and see a film on Friday. Now, Elaine's husband, Peter, Nigerian, is a lovely gentleman, and he just turned, gosh, I saw it on Facebook, 94 or something. So well done, dear Uncle Peter, and congratulations on your birthday. What a great achievement. Mum lost a little bit of touch with Peter Jegede and Elaine Jegede as time went on. I would have tea parties every week, and we would rotate the venue. Around about 1984, I applied to work in international school around about 1984, I applied to work in the international school in the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, fondly known as the IITA, International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, and was accepted. It was about a 35-minute drive off to the east of Ibadan, of this area where they would have crops to study agriculture, kind of an open area, beautiful, but with a pool and a clubhouse. The head was a Welshman. I had a driver who took me there for 7:30. Mum was so happy to be working the IITA. I was back home at 1:30 p.m. After a rest, I gave English lessons to 2 boys from Israel and another European family in our house. One of the people and children that Mum taught called, began with a T, Tokamoto or something like that, who she taught English. He faithfully kept in touch with Mum for like the next 20 years and invited Mum to his wedding in Japan. She couldn't go, of course, and it only recently fizzled out before she passed away. But isn't that amazing that she kept in touch with one of her students? She didn't mention Japanese though, but she did teach a Japanese boy. The Welshman was there for 1 year, and he was replaced by Neil and Angie. Neil was the head, but both were teachers. As an aside, in this house we had a dog and called him Heinz. 57 varieties. I chose him from a litter from an expat. In the end, we sadly had to put him down since we were all leaving Nigeria. Even my dad left for a while, and there was no one to look after him. 1988. In 1985, Peter went to Australia to work for 6 months, and that's when I saw the light that I'd have to emigrate. So in 1989, I did finally emigrate. One Christmas, Peter and Simon came back from London because Simon was schooling there and I was working there. Oh, Simon was, yes, he was in uni and I was working, and met the Fabumis. It was great to meet the Fabumi girls. They took them to IITA along with Femi Oniinde, and it was a lovely resource to have. They had a clubhouse. Gosh, we had a great time. In IITA, I played the piano for the Christmas party at the top man's house. Nice food and company and lights all the way up the path. Peter and Simon were there. I remember that. And that was some of the memories of Mum's 11 years, 6 years in teaching in All Saints, and then the remainder of her years, 5 years in the IITA, teaching, always teaching, never resting on her laurels. And I can just say that she retired, so after she left for London in June 1989, after 28 years in Nigeria, which is an absolutely remarkable stay. Always industrious, always teaching, always being creative, always raising her family as a top priority and us children, whilst keeping an eye on her family in Wales. Always watching this country grow at such a rapid rate in these different locations. And what I will do now is to say that I will make an addendum video that I will do later, because I have an appendix. Appendix is some of her notes, preparatory notes, but more importantly, she had some notes on the strategy of the book, how she would do the strategy of this book, points that she would wish to accentuate, the tone of the book, and some other ideas. So I will add that on it, and you'll see a little bit of a disjoint in the video. But I thank you. If any of you are still here towards the end, we have gone for 2 hours. So I hope that it's been something that has been worthwhile for you, especially some of you who've actually been players in the story that Mum actually knew and has spent wonderful quality time within Nigeria. There are many of you that are still with us, and how wonderful that you know her story. And whenever I meet or speak with you, I feel Mum coming through you. And so I really mean that I think that's how people remain in the world, isn't it? You live on in, she lives on in you. Mum, she lives on in you. And I couldn't be more privileged to have had this chance to relive Mum's life of her years in Nigeria. And I know the love comes across, doesn't it, of how it was a wonderful time, a time of innocence, and that comes from the population, sparsely inhabited land. And I just like to mention, talking about sparseness, Mum introduced me to an author called Alexandra McCall Smith, who has written about 20 novels, all about the #1 ladies' detective agency set in Botswana. They are so charming, if you ever get a chance to read them. And Botswana is a huge nation, and you know what? It's only got 2.3 million people in it. It's the sparsest density, the country which is the most sparsely populated in the world. And here's Nigeria with 220 million people. So when Mum got there, it must have been a little bit like that Botswana-ish in a way, in its sparseness. And I'd always thought that if Mum wrote her book and embellished, she would have taken on some of the charming techniques that these novels, which were works of fiction, the #1 ladies' detective agency set in Botswana, used, because there's certain magic to those books. I think I've read about 6 of them, maybe even more. And I'd always thought there was just a slight parallel to Mum's writing, if she could inject some of that into the book. So I think what I will actually do is, rather than add the addendum, is I will just go on and cover now, because I've got myself into it. The preparatory notes of the outline are what we've already covered. It just puts a tiny bit of, it gives the timeline and the dates, but puts a tiny bit of the main highlights, but we've already been through them in detail. She adds that when she left London there's some new bits in the outline. When she left London in June 1989 after 28 years, she then went to work as a teacher in Peckham. She had 2 supply jobs, and then she joined St. Mary's Magdalene Church School from 1989 to 1995. That's 6 years and plus 1 year of supply. So she retired from teaching the term ending March 1995. She was nearly 65, and then she had 1 year supply at Mary Magdalene, so she left in March 1996. And so that meant about 46 years of teaching. So she had this extra stint at the end of about 7 years in Peckham. And she'd faithfully take that bus every day and pack her sandwiches. She just didn't know how to not work. She was just so amazing. And Simon's comment of, how can we find ourselves wives that would chalk up to Mum, was something that I also used to think myself. Femi then retired from around about the same time, as she writes. Femi retired from work then too. And so Dad came over to the UK in the end, and he worked in Lambeth as a bridge engineer for a while. So let me just read a little bit of this, seeing as I've said I'm in the appendix. So here, what this appendix is about is she had some notes that I showed you right at the beginning. Book strategy. Chronological book. She said, it seems easy, but it could sound like your obituary. Potpourri book. Potpourri means constantly changing vista. Here they are. These are her little notes on how she'd write the book. Constantly changing vista. Life under various headings. Only include the Nigerian life. Early life, just put the background only, she said. She was thinking how she'd do it. Introduce yourself, she put. First chapter, this book is an account of my life in Nigeria. Second chapter, school days, earliest memories. Odds and sods chapter, things that don't gel. She made a note of that. Workbook folder, holding areas of material. She wanted to have a workbook. Synopsis, rough outline, which she's done here. Other possible titles, A Life Left in Africa. Yeah, because she was so sad about the way she needed to leave for safety reasons, and then with Dad passing, we sold all the homes that we had. All the holdings we had. Other possible title, An Unusual Life. she puts here. Cram as much interest and drama into the memories as you can. Selected highlights of life. Diaries. Mom kept diaries. She had a wealth of diaries all the way till she lost her vision. If she'd have picked through those, she really would have, what she really needed was time off, but she was always teaching. That's not quite true. What she needed was time away from being such a giver to others, I think, because she had retired. 35,000 words she put, plus. And this synopsis that you've read, including her preface, is just under 6,000 words. So it's 6 times shorter. She would have embellished it by 6 times to make it 6 with many other things. It would have just swollen. She mentioned probus, which are clubs for retired or semi-retired people. She probably wanted to join a probus. So that was the book's strategy. Points to accentuate, she said. The saddest day of my life, she put Femi's death. The happiest days of my life, when the children were small in Nigeria. True. Most embarrassing moment? She didn't say. Things I wished I had known. My most memorable relatives, Isaac, which is Dad, the gentleman that came to my graduation, Bale, the chief of the family, which was Dad's father, and then passed to the eldest son. And then the most memorable places I have ever visited, this is, Akure is just out this way, about 100 kilometers or so. We would go to waterfalls and historic points of interest. Mum and Dad loved waterfalls. We drove all the way down to Warri. We didn't get to Port Harcourt. Port Harcourt is huge. Port Harcourt is one of the biggest places down in the southern part of Nigeria, with a population of 3.3 million now. Warri is about 0.9 million at the moment. Port Harcourt is the biggest centre down in the south, but we didn't quite get there. I remember the trip, and then we turned back for some reason. So we travelled around a bit. The turning point of my life, meeting and marrying Femi. Places in Nigeria, children, teaching jobs, leaving Nigeria to work here, London in brackets. Nigeria, celebrating births, marriages, deaths, a lot to write here. Houses I've lived in, schools I've taught in. Then this is very sweet to me. Tone of the book. Show how drama affected you, how things affected you. Wear your heart on your sleeve. Be friendly and candid. Be warm and amusing. Just be yourself, relax. Tell your story simply and directly in your own words. Write the way you talk. Good autobiographical reading evokes an emotional response from the reader. True. Blend narrative, descriptive writing, and emotional writing. Action. Short sentences with strong, active, punchy verbs. Use the 5 senses: sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. We're here now. Be objective, she puts in capital letters. Tricky. Not over-sentimental, she puts in capital letters. And she was not over-sentimental as a person at all. She had a good balance on that. Not self-obsessed or important, capital letters, and she was not self-obsessed. Prune, capital letters. Keep it tight. And this is the part that makes me the most emotional of all, where she wrote, check for entertainment value, a cracking read. That's what she wanted. Mum was an avid reader, and her favorite genre was murder mystery. And even after she lost her vision, she used to audiobook so many murder mystery novels. James Patterson, Lee Childs, and loads of other authors that I used to get from Audible for my mum. A cracking read. She certainly was experienced with novels, so she knew what a cracking read was. It would have been difficult to convert it, but this was just a rough sketch, as we've seen. It would have been 6 times longer than this. Publishers, she wrote next. She was looking at publishers. A reputable publisher, the Writers and Artists Yearbook. Contact Society of Authors, 84 Drayton Gardens, London, Southwest 10. How to Publish Your Own Book, Vernon Coleman, £14.99. Publisher, Blue Books, ISBN, She gives a number. A Practical Guide to Publishing Books Using Your PC, which she'd learned how to use, by Peter Domansky, £12.99. Publisher, Domansky, Irvin Books, ISBN number given. Clues from Peter's photos with dates. Simon, 1978, Trent College. March, 1968, on MV Oriel. She had a picture. Leave in England, 1967. She had a picture. She would have put them in, you see. Class 1. Mrs. Oyawoye, I remember her fondly. And Peter, 1968, in that, when I went to the All Saint Church School, Ibadan. New camera, Christmas 1969. Kitchen in Ibadan, 1970. My new Morris Minor, 1970. We had a stunning picture of that car. Visit to Kanji Dam, 1970. Tio and Harrison, our houseboys, 1971. Togo, 1965. I didn't think we quite went there that early, but... So those are some of the things she would have put in. That is the end of the book. So I thought that I would add the addendum on a separate video in the interest of my fatigue, but I've managed to add that in now, making for a complete package of Mum's words, which were framed by my foreword, introduced by herself, and taken location and location through her life of 28 years, along with all the props so that it became more meaningful for you, along with a little bit of background on this extraordinary nation, Nigeria, which looms like a giant on the stage of Africa. 16% of the population, 1 in 5 black Africans being a Nigerian, population sent to head towards 500 million in the decades plus following. Quite a powerhouse, and for Mum to have witnessed its growth from pre-oil boom to post-oil boom, and fallen in love with the place, and having her heart somewhat broken when, with Dad's passing, the relationship became more distant. But every time I would introduce a Nigerian friend to Mum, she would take the greatest interest of all, because she truly did feel partially Nigerian. The other thing I think you've noticed is the great care that my father had for my mum, and the great protection. And I've mentioned that, thank you, Dad. You gave the framework, and without you there would have been no stage. He put the stage there for her to be upon. And so it is quite frequently in the way these things work. And yet within that stage, he fulfilled his great promise to her father to have her come home whenever she wanted, let her do her thing, let her work as she wanted. He didn't control her. He put no undue influence on her whatsoever. He loved her. He mourned with her when she had her loss. And even though he wasn't a man of great number of words, you could always rely on him to do the right thing, the moral and the decent thing. He was an understated man. And as I bring both my parents to my mind every single day, I see them together, or doing whatever they wish, because they have already left their mark in this world as we still remain, and ours is but to pay it forward and help others, to bless others as we have been blessed, for not everyone could have had a childhood like this, Who could have had a childhood like this? It can't be taken for granted. And Nigeria remains in my heart. Whenever anyone tries to take advantage of me and thinks perhaps I'm a little bit soft or kind, I think there's a Nigerian waiting for you like this, right in the center of me. So I'm eternally grateful for the strength that this place provides me and the blessings of my parents staying together for so long, even though it would have been very difficult and hard, as with all relationships, especially one of such mixed origins. They did it and showed us that love can exist in this world. Also financially, we all went to university. My dad always provided. He was not a greedy man. And Mum's great sensibleness. Gosh, I'm blessed to have inherited both these influences within my DNA. And so thank you, dear parents. Thank you, dear Mum. I think my foreword said it all, as far as I can say, is I wanted to put this book into the world where it belongs, as per your wish, dear Mum. And as usual, when you speak to me, you said to me, you can do it if you want, because you never want to put me out, ever. Selfless, as I've said before. But I decided that I would like to put this forward, have your name, Elizabeth, on people's lips again. And as it's posted on the website for the streaming site, alongside your funeral, Mum, may it be balanced, that somber, dark-seeming event is balanced by the light and levity of your life and your groundbreaking, brave decision to have a life that was really different. Think of all those trips up and down on these boats and flying in Africa, and people imagined they lived in huts at the time with spears and things. And yet your great foresight knew that you'd have within these boundaries an adventure like no other. And always, always, always nimbly stepping, as I said, not putting a foot wrong. Always doing the right thing at the right time, not getting into trouble, ever, really. And issuing kindness and having it reflected back to you, karmically safe, not making any jarring moves. This is the lesson, and why I say that you are great, Mum. Subdued greatness. You need to look carefully, but if more emulated your style and how you lived, they would be happier. Also discipline. Routine, getting up at the same time every day. Food, preparation, buying ahead so that you eat with quality, doing the shopping, never being on the back foot. Fantastic with time, to my shame. You controlled it. It didn't control you, and that's not an easy feat. Spatially, not so strong, but you still drove all around Ibadan, complicated situations. You were very able. You were very able. So I happily sing your praises. How long does it take? 2-3 hours and it's done. It's not that difficult. I couldn't leave your notes lying here, all scratchy and sketched. They deserve to be highlighted, and so that if ever anyone brings you to mind, they think, oh, I know a lot more about Betty now, and what she did as an example for others to lead. Discipline, right action, kindness, and awareness as well. You were no fool, but you would let insults slide off you. Mostly you succeeded in not taking any of them to heart, which was another great example. You were tolerant of others, strong but quiet, subdued greatness. So I am so lucky to have you reside within me, dear Mum, and I want to do you proud by bringing you to the attention of anyone that watches this video that you are truly great and led a great life. You may not be buried in some vast tomb, but you do sit in a beautiful cemetery with your husband. And I will do anything to glorify your name and Dad's name. We truly have been great through you. And it always ends with me saying, all that can be said is thank you. Just as now King Charles said of his mother, the Queen. I listened carefully and watched everything. You were the Queen there during that time as well. You were there. And he was left with just 2 words for his great mother. Thank you. Thank you. But you know that I do want to meet you again. So I can thank you even closer than I do now. So I hope this expose of your life, as I said, what did I call it? This innocent work may work a delightful magic on others, in part due to its innocence and relative simplicity, that it might imbue some spirit as you come through me to them, and that on a selfish note it might bring some peace to myself, knowing that I have done justice to making sure that you do not go to the grave silently, even though you were willing to do so. That I insist you do not go to the grave silently. For someone who had almost 30 years out in Africa and Nigeria, teaching thousands of children, let's say hundreds, and coming back to such a decent, disciplined life, an example of how to be fulfilled, never really showing much regret, but through your discipline and using every card you were given, you showed how a good life can be led. No greed, satisfied with what a person should be satisfied with, and one has to look carefully to see the subdued greatness, and that I ensure you do not go to the grave quietly after such a great life, Mum, of 92 years. And if necessary, I shall speak yet more to make sure that does not happen, and that people remain aware of your great spirit, that it should stay in this world, as I said, yet further and longer. And of course, selfishly, that's where I can feel it stronger. So with my remaining years, I shall try and honor you and Dad, to pay you back for the good you've given to us, to pay it forward, and always live in the hope that somehow we will meet again, however that is organized. And meanwhile, dear Mum, I bring you and Dad to mind first thing every morning, every single morning, that may you both be well and be at peace and be happy and look down on us without too much worry, that we shall express the strength you gave us to survive in ways which minimize suffering, for there is always suffering in the world. And may you truly be at peace that you deserved. This is what I pray for you every morning. And if it's right, may you be together, the both of you. And may before too long I visit the shores of the UK and stand by both your graves again. And may you speak to me, and I speak to you, and may our communication always be strong, for I am enhanced by your passing. And I thank you for that gift. Things have changed, but your gift sits upon me. Thank you. Thank you very much. Those words resound in my mind. I love you. I love you deeply, Mum. And I've been so saddened to see you suffer at the end. May you be free now. I couldn't show my grief to the public, and perhaps this is the closest I've come to show it to the world. But of course, inside I was bereft beyond belief and heartbroken, but always balanced by the fact of your suffering at the other side. And was it not better you were free? And I love you so much, Dad. Quiet though you were, it's all the more admirable. Going through your book, Mum, of your life together, only reminded me of how glorious a life that I have had, as you both set the stage for me to act upon in my life. And so the most important thing is gratitude, is it not? For without that, everything is grey. We have so much, a bounty in fact. And the Islamic tradition here, they've told me, you should not remain sad too long. No, indeed, I'm conscious of that as well. But mine was that you should not go to the grave quietly. I'd like your name up in lights, Mum, somehow. How can I make this a Broadway production or get you to Hollywood? Could I do it? I could try. So dear Mum, I love you deeply, and I've loved you fiercely. And dear Dad, without you, there would be nothing. I love you deeply, and I miss you both. And I hope I see you again. I shall visit you in the UK as soon as I can. And to all of you listening here, this eulogizing at the end is somewhat channeled through me for completeness, never to be easily repeated again, these words. I hope through me representing this here on this earth plane, Mum, that you too have relived your life and seen it ordered out, so that when you look down you can easily recall your success, as I said. For your mission has been a resounding success. That's what it is, and I'd like to summarize it. I'd like to have a place people can go and read and see and listen to your resounding success as I shout it from the rooftops. My lovely Mum, thank you for everything. It's endless, endless. One thing I almost forgot to say. When I left to become a boarding student in 1972, we tracked it, didn't we? Yes, I had to become a boarder because we were about to move to Lagos. After that time, Mum, we never lived together again since I was 12 years old, and yet we were so close. I was either a boarding student in university abroad, and you were in Ibadan, working abroad, you were in Ibadan, and as soon as you came to live in London at 1989, I did have my house across town, I emigrated to Australia. You arrived in London and I left, and that's why you visited me 11 times in Australia. 7 times, I should say. No, 11 times I was there. That's right. 11 times you crossed over. 6 years in Melbourne and 7 years in Perth. And so we never lived together again in the same house. It was always visits and visits and visits in lands far away. We were barely in the same country. That's remarkable. With our closeness, you'd have thought we were living in each other's lap, but we weren't. It was a distanced relationship, which we made the most of. 8 years in Brunei, 2 years in Thailand, 11 years in Qatar now, and 13 years in Australia, and I was in London and you in Nigeria. We never crossed again, did we? I don't think even you, Mum, had remarked upon the fact that we've not been together all. We didn't ever live in the same place. People would have been shocked to hear that because they know that we are close. Maybe it made the heart grow fonder. But now I realize I really should end. This add-on was not planned. Let me look around at this view. I planned to get a bit more daylight into the video, but at least there was some daylight, and I didn't know how long it would last. Thank you everybody for listening to this. I really do appreciate it. If anyone's watched to the end, then it's a remarkable feat, and I couldn't be more grateful to you for listening. Through you, you amplify Mum and Dad, and they are rejoiced in heaven. So I'll end now, and with gratitude in my heart for doing something that I truly had wanted to do for a while, and I'll see what I can do with this, if it will form some kind of booklet. Not sure if I can get those pictures that Mum thought about. They're in the UK at the moment, somewhere, perhaps. But my love to all, and who've watched this. I hope through acting with my intuition that it does something beyond what my mind tells me, that it will work a magic. Faith, I guess, is the trick, isn't it? If one has faith, the magic then happens. So my dear Mum, I love you so deeply, and I miss you, and I've grieved for you beyond what has been shown to the world. balanced by the fact you led an amazingly long life, but somehow I still wanted to come back from Qatar and be by your side for longer. That's the bit that I did not expect. I'd planned to leave here and come and be with you full time, but you knew better. You didn't want to tie my life up, and so you quickly left. And I saw your beauty at the end, as I said, and it's left me an indelible burn of light, though. I love you so much, Mum and Dad. Thank you for the wonderful life you've given me and my brothers and all that were around you. So in ending, thank you, and thanks to all those who've watched till the end. Great, great appreciation to you, and I look forward to speaking with many of you personally into the years. You are all the joy of my life, truly. And if I ever want to meet Mum again, I meet her through you, truly. That's the way it works. And then the mechanism of insisting that life becomes worth living, enjoyable, and special is giving back the gift of Mum's example on how to live your life and be appreciative of the life and enjoy the life. This is the gift. This is the best way I can pay you back, Mum and Dad. And the people that watch this video are participants in allowing me to do that. Everything is connected. So you are the players on the stage, and hopefully I'm a player on your stage, and through that we will enrich ourselves and be grateful for our lives. And I thank you, Mum, for this great example. Truly, I feel that you've been knitted back into the fabric of life here, hopefully by sharing this, that somehow you're here and you're ever more strong in your friends and you live through your friends. And I will be able to enjoy you through your friends. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, dear Mum and Dad. Bless you wherever you may be in heaven. And may we meet again.